Hi YouTube, Darth here. I wanted to start a new regular on this channel where I have some midweek content that is maybe a little bit more informal. Mostly to let me talk about topics that aren't big enough for an entire video, whatever is on my mind, or things that are more channel related. A way to interact more with you out there, yes, you. As part of this, there will be a Q&A for episodes going forward that will be sourced from the comments. Even the lurkers can benefit. So what's up Wednesday it is. First up, something from the top of my mind is how I believe Battlefield 4 is still the best of the series. It is a toss-up really between that and Battlefield 3, at least in my mind. From a game mechanics perspective, I find the gunplay to be more interesting than Battlefield 3, the suppression is sure of a heck a lot better, and of the two, I think the core gameplay is just plain better in Battlefield 4. Now that being said, there's a ton of things I think hobble Battlefield 4, the first being the maps. By and large, I think the maps in Battlefield 4 just had too many vehicles and were too enormous and had lots of pointless stretches to them. And while I can enjoy a large map, I think maps like Langhang Dam and Rogue Transmission are just awful. Battlefield 3 at least knew how to moderate vehicles and large maps, at least outside of Armored Kill. I think my favorite map in recent memory is Grand Bazaar, and that map only had Humvees and an LAV per side. Plus, half the remastered maps from Battlefield 2 were generally pretty great. I love Sharkey Peninsula and Return to Karkand. I don't know why Wake came back, it doesn't work at all in BF3's mechanics, and Gulf of Oman is okay in doses. Why Gulf came back again in Battlefield 4 is anybody's guess. I mean, Sen Crossing sure would have been nice. But ultimately, I like Battlefield more for its mechanics and Battlefield 3 more for its maps. Well, most of them at least. Overall, I do like Battlefield 4 the most in the series, and I find myself coming back to it a lot. Something about the modern setting really appeals to me, and I think the core gameplay is about as solid as you could ask from the franchise. At least after a year and a half of patching. Now let's get into a little bit of Q&A, and I did this based on some questions from Twitter this time around, but in the future I'll be basing my questions on things asked in this episode's comments. First of these is from Noah N, who asked, did you ever play Battlefield 2? If so, what are your opinions on it compared to the rest of the series? Why did you not like Battlefield 1? Last, and also least, do I get a special prize for killing you once during the BF5 Alpha? As it turns out, I did play a fair bit of Battlefield 2 when it came out. This was back in the time when I was really starting to get into Warcraft, so I didn't spend a whole lot of time with Battlefield 2 past the first month. At the time, I really only had Battlefield 1942 and Vietnam to compare it against, and I had a working theory at the time that DICE made only okay basic gameplay for games, but great platforms for mods. I think most of my time played in Battlefield 1942 and Battlefield Vietnam were in mods. In Battlefield 1942, I primarily played Desert Combat, and in Vietnam, I played something called Point of Existence. Both modern spins on the core gameplay of Battlefield. So I was pretty excited to try out what DICE was doing with the modern setting. I've got to say that my experience with Battlefield 2 was pretty disappointing. I played primarily vehicles in Battlefield 1942 and Vietnam since the core gameplay around infantry was way behind the times in both games. Battlefield 2 was the first time I found Battlefield vehicle gameplay really disappointing. I tried picking up the infantry gameplay, and I also found that somewhat irksome as it still had the old baggage of previous two games' clunkiness and wasn't quite there overall. It wasn't as satisfying as Operation Flashpoint, and it wasn't as tight as Counter-Strike, both of which I had played heavily by that point. And by the way, as a Cold War military equipment buff, I freaking loved Operation Flashpoint. It's not surprising that its spiritual successor in Arma is successful to this day. Also in Battlefield 2, the unlock system was pretty enraging to me. I didn't see any reason why I should have to spend time with what I perceived to be the underpowered weapons in the game in order to not suck. Now these unlock systems are everywhere these days, but at the time this was relatively new and I wasn't ready for it. So overall, Battlefield 2 was a bit disappointing for me. Looking back, I think I wasn't entirely wrong, but I should have given it a bit more time than I did. As for why I stopped playing Battlefield 1, it ended up being a constant fight against the balancing and matchmaking in that game. The harder I played, the more I felt like my team was not. And I wasn't wrong, the system actually does work against you, which I detailed in a video around that time. So it's really not a lot of fun to be constantly fighting uphill like a modern Sisyphus. I also think the game had the same problem that Battlefield 4 did, which was lackluster map design. Unfortunately, the first big map update with Giant Shadow was also a huge flop, at least in my book. Here was another enormous map that also tends to skew to one side, and the infantry action was mostly a fustercluck. Compare this to Amiens, which was easily the best release map. Between Giant Shadow and having to play Suez constantly, the content got very stale fast. So really what killed Battlefield 1 for me was too slow a pace of content, lackluster launch map content, and a balancing system that felt like an absolute punishment. The only time I had fun was when I was flying a biplane, and at that point I might as well be playing War Thunder. As for getting a special prize for killing me in the Battlefield 5 Alpha, well, you get to be a founding member of the huge club of people who are going to kill me a lot in Battlefield 5. Next is from Sir Stewie, who wrote, "What is the ideal air, vehicle, infantry balance?" To which I think I'm going to refer to some of my earlier thoughts in this video. Battlefield has always been a mix of all these three things, but unless it's a vehicle-only map, most people are going to be spending their time walking around from point to point. I honestly think that Grand Bazaar is probably about as close as we can get to a perfect Battlefield experience. Lots of tight infantry action, limited on vehicles, and although there is no air component, it is not missed. Every point is easily attacked by infantry, there are many ways to flank while still guarding yourself with cover, and who is in the vehicles matters tremendously to your team. I think vehicle balance gets lost in the noise in Battlefield 4. Every vanilla map has just about every vehicle and multiples of them. It didn't matter if one died because there was always another around the corner. As a vehicle jockey, you often never got the time to help your team press an advantage. The only place where this tightness of combat existed was in the air. There were only ever 2 planes up, and if you were good, you could keep the enemy team's air down and give a decent assist to your ground game by flattening enemy vehicles. Which is why I'm pretty stoked about Battlefield 5. The infantry combat is good, and at least the initial map has reasonable pacing for those on foot. Narvik wasn't overloaded with tanks and vehicles, and though they felt a bit underpowered, when in the hands of a good player, they could make a real difference when pushing a point. Planes still need a ton of work though. I don't know what DICE was thinking in the alpha. They were basically pointless between the unfinished stats and change to spotting mechanics. But if the rest of the maps can be as good as Narvik, I'm really excited for what Battlefield 5 might turn out to be. But it's a limited look into what will be a much larger game. If Narvik turns out to be the lone Amiens of Battlefield 5, it's going to be a lackluster experience. Not every map needs to be the Battle of Kursk. So to answer the question fully, I think Battlefield should be about 80% infantry play, 20% vehicles. Because that's really where people are going to spend their time. Different maps can change that up, but not every map has to have 40 vehicles so everybody can play Battlefield War Thunder Edition. And I really do think Battlefield feels best with tight infantry action and meaningful vehicle combat, emphasis on meaningful. And finally, my last question comes from fellow A-Squad member Punisher. What beer goes best with a BLT? And for that, I'm going to have to go with La Fin du Monde. Though they're a bit pricey per bottle, it's probably my favorite beer, at least right now. I like mostly ales, and I'm not really the fanciest beer drinker, but gosh, the Fin du Monde is excellent with a meal or just by itself. And if you're looking to make your BLT just a little bit more interesting, try adding some homemade guacamole to it instead of mayo or other condiments. It's really good. That's it for this episode of What's Up Wednesday. If you've got questions for my next episode, drop them in the comments below. I'm hoping to do these every week, so keep them coming even if I don't get them answered next week. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time, YouTube.